Thanks everyone. My name is Walker Bolger. I'm Senior Digital Product Manager with Carrier. I work on our Abound platform, and my vertical is energy and sustainability. And Abound is our data aggregation, data integration platform. We focus mainly on commercial, but it's essentially our platform for bringing together very disparate sources of data to make them available for people to do analytics or visualizations or trending and things like that. When Ron asked me to speak at this event, I really didn't have a topic in mind, which is, kind of problematic for a speaking engagement. But so kind of when I thought about it, ruminated about it a little bit, what I thought about was, what did I want you, the proverbial in-person live audience or virtual audience, to take away from this? Like, it really kind of wanted to give you something. I didn't really want to make a sales pitch. I didn't really want to give a TED talk where I, give some like novel theory of some kind that you forget about the second you leave the room. But this is more of like kind of a primer that I wanted to tell you about, so you can talk to people and think about smart buildings and analytics and why you should be thinking about the data in your buildings. So this is kind of just an approach. It's really, I'm trying to be the Gandalf to kind of ruin the flow. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
It's all in the delivery, isn't it? I'm trying to be the Gandalf to your Bilbo, set you off on an adventure to find the hoard under the dragon at the end of the day. So what I want to talk about is a little bit about automated monitoring analytics, what it is, so why we should talk about it, why you should think about it. I want to get into the two things I call data and insights. Then I want to take a step further and talk about what I call the 3 dangers of data. There's actually a 4th, but I'm going to let Mr. Mendelson talk about the 4th one, and take a little bit into the future. And then I want to cover a little bit about Abound and Carrier, what we do. Like I said, this is not a sales pitch, but I do want to give you kind of a sense of what we do. So automated monitoring and analytics. This is just a definition. Other people might have different definitions, but this is just a working definition of it. And it's basically just utilizing sensors, meters, external services, APIs, control systems, external APIs, to automatically collect and analyze building operation data to generate insights to optimize performance, reduce costs, improve building health. So those are the 3 things that I try, we categorize when we look at data, big data, building data. These are the 3 things we kind of think about as we built Abound. And so why do we really want to think about optimizing performance, reducing costs, or improving building health? And one is that commercial buildings, especially, using a ton of energy, way more than we think. About 35% of the total electricity consumed in the United States. That contributes about 60% of all carbon emissions in the United States. And the DOE, where these numbers come from, has estimated about 30% of the energy in commercial spaces is waste. It's wasted, non-effective energy. That, brief calculation, that's about 10% of all of our electricity consumed in the United States is wasted in buildings. It's also important to think about that we live in buildings. Maybe, the pandemic did change that to a degree, but we spend about 90% of our time indoors. And green buildings, high-performing buildings, which are buildings that exceed ratings for ASHRAE ratings for ventilation, they actually improve our lives. They've studied the cognitive function test survey that Carrier did. We noticed that it improves, cognitive abilities increase, crisis response scores go up, information usage scores go up, strategy scores go up. In addition, you get reductions in building complaints about things that are related to what they call building health, like odors, staleness, CO2. And people who live in these high performance buildings actually report higher sleep scores, which I think I could benefit from, frankly. I look like a tired teenager all the time. It's also important to note that if you're in the building industry, that this is something people are thinking about. Verdantics in 2021 surveyed a bunch of real estate executives, and 77% of them listed either reducing real estate costs, improving health and well-being of building occupants, and decarbonizing their building portfolio. One of those 3 was their number 1 priority. So over 3/4 of real estate executives believe one of those 3 things is the number 1 thing that they need to focus on. with that in mind, I kind of want to get into the conceptualization of how you get this data out of buildings, generate insights. What does that mean? And so it's really the way we conceptualize it is that there's a two-tiered system or environment. This is kind of not physical, but I think it's just a good way of saying that you have two levels, which I call data and insights. And the data comes from very specific, three general sources, and that feeds up to generate what I'm calling like the top 4 insights that we at Carrier focus on. These are the 4 things that we think are what make buildings high performance, or where we see ROI from all of these for implementing any sort of smart building technologies. And so I'm going to get into them a little bit just so you have a definition of what I'm talking about. The first data source is just utilities, which is just data supplied by the utility provider. So there's like PGE, both here and in California, same acronym. But it's just data where it's, you can get cost rates, peak demand, consumption data. You also can get carbon emission data depending on where they are on the grid. The second one is monitoring and control systems. This is just utilizing meters, sensors, and asset data to measure real-time energy use and environmental conditions in a building. This is basically the building control system, your thermostats, and there's a variety of systems in buildings that we all kind of interact with. Sometimes, some more than others. There's HVAC controls, which give us like temperatures, flows, heat. There's electricity meters that give us consumption, but there's also access control systems that give us occupancy. There's zonal control systems that give us things like spatial occupancy down to the space, down to the room. Also, IAQ data, for instance, this room probably has a higher CO2 level than any of the other rooms here. And that's something you can get from these spatial controls, from control systems, especially the spatial monitoring. And then we have external services. It's kind of a catch-all, I understand, but it's basically additional sources of data that kind of exist outside the building, but nevertheless can provide us helpful information. And so this is like a weather API, because weather is very important to how we operate buildings. It might be one of the most influential factors in how you run a building. But also I heard some people talking about, I almost stepped on that. We turned everything off. That's gonna be a great joke for for everybody online. Sorry, I was saying carbon emission data. There are several protocols that actually utilize financial data. The philosophy being, how much carbon did it take to generate X amount of revenue? So that's data that can come in from like an SAP source, some other sort of accounting source that can be brought in and help contextualize data, generate insights. The insights that we're calling like the top 4, and these are just things to keep in mind when you look at smart buildings and what you want to get out of them. Like, this is how we say, these are the 4 things you should look at. They may not all apply to you or any building, but they're the 4 you should all consider. And one of them is energy analytics. And that one's relatively straightforward. It's just the process of gleaming insights from ongoing and historical energy and other utility use. And this tells you just basically how well your building's performing. How much energy is it using? Things like Energy Star. Are you using more than what a comparable building in a similar climate zone might use? The second one, and it could be a conversation in its own right, it's known as fault detection and diagnostics. But fault detection diagnostics, sometimes called FDD, is basically proactively identifying system problems and optimization opportunities before they lead to alarms, waste, occupant discomfort, or system failure. That's a fancy, long-worded way of saying predictive analytics. So it's basically taking in being able to assess if equipment is running out of spec, it's just straight up broken, might be running inefficiently. But what that does is, it helps you optimize your performance. Also increases asset lifetime, because you can plan maintenance, better scheduled maintenance for equipment. The third is Ieq and Wellness. This is monitoring indoor air quality and controlling equipment operation to maximize occupant comfort and health, utilizing science-based backed standards. And that's an important one. We at Carrier, we try to make sure all of our IAQ standards, our IAQ metrics and insights are based on some sort of standard. Like there's the well building standard, which is for IAQ conditions in the building. There's also ASHRAE. ASHRAE has settings for the American Society of Heating Refrigeration Engineers. I think is what it stands for, but they have standards for IAQ ventilation. So it's important that when you look at IAQ scores, it's more than just saying like, well, how warm is it in this room? How much, what's the CO2 level? What's, even radon is another one that counts under IAQ, but it's important to, base that off of something that gives you some kind of context into actually if your building's healthy. And the final one is greenhouse gas emissions, which is just calculating, tracking the carbon and other greenhouse gases emitted into your atmosphere, emitted into the atmosphere resulting from your building operations. That's a lot of words, but what is the important thing about data flowing into generating insights? Well, what do insights kind of do? And what I always tell people is the ROI on something on insights and data is effectively zero if you don't do anything with it. And so insights generate actions, and actions are what improve performance. And so that's essentially making the invisible visible. That whole thing. We are taking the data. You can't see CO2, you can't see your load curves anywhere, but that data exists in the ether. And taking that and making it visible so you can generate those insights to generate the actions that actually save you money, improve your performance of your building. This is just a little kind of example. What does that mean in real life? Like, what am I saying? And so one of them is, like I said, I'm not going to pitch a bound, but a bound's a good example of it. Our IAQ monitoring, we can take the data that's we have our healthy build assessments, which is our baseline. Those are the standards, the science-backed standards. But this data can feed into so many things of how we perform. It affects how we commission and balance the load. It affects how we optimize control sequences, or maybe even add supplementary purification if we need to. But then that pulls back into actual people analyzing the data, visualizing the data, trending the data, and it all kind of comes back. So it's this circular motion, because it's all about generating insights for actions. And we do have a real world example. This company called Ieq Energy is under the Carrier brand. But they did a 160 restaurant installation with Sapphire Foods in India, which runs a bunch of franchises, but mostly KFC. There are KFCs everywhere. I think they're like might be the largest franchise in the world by just sheer number of locations, maybe second to Subway. But what they did is they were in 160 restaurants in India. But what they did is they plugged into their plugged into the HVAC controls, the refrigeration, the kitchen equipment, sensors, controllers, energy meters, and they fed that into their command center, which is basically just an analytics center to monitor for alarms and other things that go to spec. And they also have an analytics engine called Cortex. That basically was their FDD engine. That was the FDD and fault detection and predictive analytics from before. But they were able to generate 6% year-over-year energy savings and 40% increase in occupant comfort compliance. So that's 6% every year. That's not like 6% from the start. That's 6% year-over-year. So that's kind of the end of the adventure map, but I do want to get into, and I'm going to try to end on time. I am going to talk to you about what I call the 3 dangers of data. Like I said, there's 4, but the 4th one's going to be covered in a different speech or a different presentation. The witches from Macbeth. But the first one is the one I call the silos. Now, the silos are historically data. That's not what I wanted. This data exists completely segmented. So these systems don't talk. And they all have their own data that they could all potentially use, but don't share. And so what does that mean? And so, going forward, you want to think about openness, demand that of your vendors. It's about making sure you're able to bridge these gaps. You don't want silos. You don't want silos of data. It leads to redundancies, waste. You want to bring in them all together. And I know that sounds kind of broad, but it's just something to know when you go to talk to maybe a smart energy building provider, is that you want them to be open. You want to build for openness. The second danger is compatibility. And this one's my favorite because it's one of those catch-all, it's one of those aha, like gotcha moments, because everyone says they're compatible. You go talk to someone and say, like, are you compatible with, I'm just going to come up with Twitter. Are you compatible with Siemens? Are you compatible with Johnson Controls? Everyone, product managers included, are not immune for this. We say, yes, of course it is. And we're only half right, because even if we're compatible, it doesn't mean the data comes in the right way. Data can come in very different ways and different hierarchies, different schemas, different frequencies, different, you need different, like, it's just compatibility is one of those things that on the surface, yes, but the devil is definitely in the details. So the question is standardization. When you go forward, when you think about these types of projects, think about standardization. And one of the schemas that I see a lot of traction going forward, we use at Carrier, so maybe I'm a little biased, is something called the BRIC schema. And it was developed at UC Berkeley, I believe. But it's basically a way of hierarchying the data. So no matter what system you use, the data, the data and data relationships, which is a big one, will all be the same. Now, they're not the only one out there that does this. Like there's other schemas. I think SkySpark is another one. But the important thing is that you think about it, that you understand that you need your schema matters and that there's more to compatibility than just ones and zeros. The final one is the volume. Buildings generate a ton of data. One of the things is that they're never off. Just because nobody's in a building does not mean it's not generating data. And to be honest, when people aren't there, that's some of the times you want to look at that data. That's when you can catch machines working when they're not supposed to be working. That's when you can see people, schedules that are wrong, unoptimized performance. But the important thing about this one that I'm trying to get at is that build for scale. But one of the good things about this type of data and connections is that you get a relatively consistent stream of data. You don't have to plan for like bursts of data. Like it's not like an event, or I worked at Nike in their marketing communications department, and we would get bursts of communication. So we'd be at like 0 messages for hours and then 100 million messages within 30 minutes, right? But with this, you don't really have to build for that. So you can be more focused on reliability and scale. So I've gone through the dangers. I didn't really touch a lot on carbon emissions. I am going to look a little bit into the future, specific on carbon emissions. And I heard some other people talking about this today. And this is the climate-related disclosures for investors rule change by the SEC. And what they're calling it, the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures. It's changes to the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Bunch of stuff, but the important thing one is, keep hitting the wrong button, is this one. The greenhouse gas emissions for accelerated and large accelerated filers. Now, don't really worry too much about that. But basically, you have to start reporting your emissions in public documents to your investors. So you're going to start to see greenhouse gas emissions in company 10Ks, quarterly reports. I highly anticipate this passing. They're standardizing on what's called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, GHG protocol, for the format and how they report it, but I highly anticipate this passing. One, there's a ton of money in the investment community behind companies that measure CO2, that report CO2, that build out these tools to help companies like Carrier ourselves. We're a large accelerated filer. Help companies calculate their emissions. And then the second reason is because the resource extraction companies actually, the people you think would be most against something like this actually already do this. They reckon that I saw a statistic that the natural gas and oil and gas and mining companies are actually some of the leading disclosures of CO2 emissions. So they're actually already doing what this rule calls for. So I highly anticipate this passing. So one of the things, again, to talk about is you saw that fourth tier of insight. Make sure you understand what your carbon emissions are. Whenever you're doing anything for monitoring, as great as it is to reduce costs, you're gonna wanna keep track of your CO2 emissions because it's gonna become important, especially if you're a large accelerated filer. This might come into effect as early as 2024. So it's coming soon.
there's more to that too, because it's not just the amount of CO2, but it's also how you're dealing with this, how you're treating your people, how you're handling. There's a whole list of things
Yeah, it's
that came out of call it a GRI.
it's climate, yeah, it's
Global resources.
predominantly risks. So yeah, it's more than just GHG emissions. That's why like it's all here. So yeah, how you the social and governance aspects, but the GHG emissions are one of the big pivotal ones
The
in
main
terms
thing
of
they're
building.
worried about, the Federal Trade Commission already has this, but the SEC is doing it, their thing, is because they wanted to be honest.
Mhm.
Because there's a lot of what they call greenwashing.
Yeah, so you'll notice it says assurance, subject to assurance, which is a accounting protocol, accounting term
So it
for.
requires an auditor.
Yep. I want to talk a little bit about Abound. Abound is Carrier's answer to what I just talked about. It's an open, scalable, cloud-based digital platform that offers a suite of connected solutions for healthier, safer, and more sustainable buildings. We built Abound. It's nascent, it's very young. We built Abound to predominantly to be about openness, interconnectivity, compatibility, as I talked about. So hold me to that standard. But the idea is that we would be the data clearinghouse to combine any sort of application you need to generate, but we focus specifically on those top 4 insights, especially in energy and sustainability. It helps carriers and market. We use our market leadership in healthy buildings, sustainability, and comfort. Focusing on occupant health and wellness, and maximizing energy efficiency and increasing occupant comfort. One of the funny things, forget his first name, but Carrier, whom we're named after, invented air conditioning. So there are people in the company that know what they're talking about. These are our brands that you may, if you may come across us with. There's our parent brand, but then all of these: Automated Logic, Eco Energy, Edwards, Noresco, and then LS2. Len LS2, Edwards is fire and safety. When LS2 is access control. The rest are building and energy related. So I think I'm right on time. Just real quick, other sources of learning. If you're interested in building, I highly recommend Nexus Labs, run by a gentleman named James Dice, probably one of the most trusted names in like building controls, this topic. You saw I used a bunch of his images. And then the impact of green buildings on cognitive function, the cogfxstudy.com. It's the study that Carrier did. I apologize, I'm spacing on the college they did it with, but they used a lot of numbers from the Harvard Medical. But this is where we got a lot of that IAQ research from. So I encourage you to check it out. There's more stuff in there that I didn't mention, but I encourage you to look at these 2 things, Nexus Labs especially, if you're interested in learning more. So